Welcome to Introductory Psychology. Today I'm going to be talking about just generally what psychology is and a little bit about the history of psychology, where it came from, where it is today a little bit, and some of the research methods that are used to investigate the subject matter of psychology, which is the study of the mind and the study of behavior. So, what exactly is psychology? Well, the traditional definition of psychology is that it's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Okay, so there are three parts to this. It's the scientific study. So, what does that mean? Well, you've probably taken many science courses before. You're taking one right now. Psychology is a science, it's a field of science. You've probably taken other science courses, biology, chemistry, physics, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what science is. Science is a way of investigating things. It's very different than our day to day lives where we make observations. The types of observations that we make in science are objective and they are based on our experience. Uh, when I say objective, what I mean is that they are observable by anyone. Okay, there are some observations that some people claim to be able to make that are not observable by others. So, for instance, fortune tellers, psychics, they claim that they can tell you things that are not directly observable by other people. And anytime you're dealing with things that are not directly observable by others, except for the person that is claiming to make that observation, that sort of falls outside the realm of science. Okay, so it's a scientific study. All right, it's a science. It's the scientific study of behavior. Well, what is behavior? Behavior is basically anything that either can be observed or cannot necessarily be observed. What I mean by that is that some people would consider mental processes to be subsumed under the category of behavior. So behavior could be either observable or overt, or it could be unobservable or covert. So, for example, many times you could be having a conversation with somebody and they might be looking at you, and you would infer perhaps that they're paying attention to what you're saying to them. That's overt behavior. You're seeing them look at you. On the other hand, they may not be paying attention to anything that you're saying. They might be paying attention to their internal thoughts. And you couldn't necessarily tell which one they were paying attention to. Just because their eyes are directed at you doesn't mean that you necessarily have their attention. They could be thinking about what they're going to be doing later today, what they have to buy from the grocery store. They could be thinking about an upcoming exam. So that's what I mean when I say that behavior can be covert. That is, it cannot be observed directly on the surface. And like I said, that taps into the third part of the definition, the mental processes. So attention, concentration, alertness, intelligence, emotions. These are all aspects of mental processes. Mental processes are the things that go on inside of our mind that result many times in directly observable behaviors. So psychology is the scientific study of both of those aspects of behavior. Now, the other thing about psychology is that there are many misconceptions about psychology. Again, psychology is a science just like any other branch of science, but people don't often have the same kinds of misconceptions in other fields of science. For instance, you don't have a whole lot of misconceptions about the way that atoms interact with one another, right? So you don't have the same sort of misconceptions in chemistry that you do in psychology. And part of the reason for that is that you have lots of experience with behavior. You don't have lots of experience with subatomic particles, so you don't necessarily have the same sorts of biases in those other fields of science. But as I said, psychology is a science. It's based on making observations. You make observations. The big difference is that the observations that we tend to make in our day-to-day lives are not the same observations that scientists attempt to make. And the reason why is that the observations that we make are subject to many biases that the scientific method can help to overcome. so that there's less bias in the observations that we make. For instance, what I mean by this is that we tend to notice some things and we tend to not notice others. You tend to notice what you expect to see, and you tend to not notice things that you don't expect to see. And so there are tons and tons of examples of misconceptions in psychology, and these true or false questions here, or statements rather, they sort of get at the idea that many times there are sayings that either could be interpreted two different ways, or there are sayings that are not necessarily true. In fact, probably one of the biggest and perhaps most frustrating myths among psychology is the idea that we only use 10% of our brain. Many people believe that. Even people in the academic fields believe that. So it's not as if it's only certain people that are susceptible to these misconceptions in psychology. It's many people. But psychologists are less susceptible to these misconceptions because we know, first of all, how do we arrive at the knowledge that we arrive at? Well, we arrive at it by using the scientific method, and that's what we'll be talking about when we talk about the research methods that psychologists use to study behavior and mental processes. But we do need to be very careful of things that sound like they're related to the field of psychology but are not. And these are often referred to as pseudopsychologies. Okay, they give the appearance of science, but they're false. So, for instance, psychics, mediums, palmists, astrologers, none of those things have anything to do with science, although they may have the appearance of being scientific. The Amazing Randy is well known for attempting to debunk many of the predictions that psychics, for instance, would make. And he's got a TED Talk that I would recommend listening to because it really demonstrates that he's out to debunk the myths that many pseudopsychologists would attempt to get other people to believe. So psychology has four goals, okay? To describe behavior, to explain behavior, to predict behavior, and to change behavior. And some of these things are much more easily accomplished than others. For instance, it can be, it's often considered to be much easier to describe a behavior than it is to either explain, predict, or change a behavior. Likewise, it can be much easier to predict a behavior than it can be to explain why a behavior occurs. Okay, so some examples of descriptions of behavior are just that boys are more aggressive than girls, and this is something that we can conclude just on the basis of observation. We would first have to define what aggression is exactly, but then we could simply observe some boys and observe some girls, count the number of aggressive acts that we observe in a certain time period, and we can just compare those two numbers. It's very simple. On the other hand, explaining, why are boys more aggressive than girls? Well, that's a far more complex question. So the goal of explaining attempts to answer the question of why does a behavior occur. So as an example of something that we do have some idea of why certain behaviors occur comes from research that indicates that there are many interacting causes or explanations for aggression, but some of those include things like culture. Culture plays a role in the expression of aggression, learning, genes, brain damage, and even levels of testosterone. Okay? Predicting when a behavior occurs, sometimes this is quite difficult in and of itself, but again, it's usually easier to make a prediction than to explain why a behavior occurs. So, for instance, knowing that alcohol leads to increased aggression, we can predict that more fights will erupt in places where alcohol is consumed than in those where alcohol isn't consumed. Okay? It doesn't necessarily tell us why does that aggression occur. We don't necessarily know that it's because people were ingesting alcohol. Just to give you an example of why we don't necessarily know that, it could be that there are certain environments in which people drink alcohol. And it's those environments that cause people to act aggressively, not the alcohol itself. Okay? It could be one or it could be the other, or it could be some combination of the two. Even though we can make a prediction about increases in levels of aggression, we don't necessarily know why that occurs. And to change behavior, again, this can vary in its difficulty. I'm sure that most of us can relate to the fact that we would like to change certain behaviors that we engage in, and it's not always that easy to do. Okay, it doesn't take very long to think of a number of examples. People want to start exercising, they want to lose weight, they want to change their diet, they want to stop smoking, they want to stop drinking. They have a difficult time doing this. But psychologists do help people to try to change. That's one of the things that psychologists do to improve their work environment, for instance, stop addictive behaviors, become less depressed, improve their family relationships, etc., etc. Okay, but that is one of the major goals, one of the 4 goals of psychology. Psychology is an extremely broad field. Okay, there are many different things that psychologists do. Again, thinking about the misconceptions that that can be seen in psychology, one of the misconceptions is that most psychologists are therapists, and that's it couldn't be further from the truth. Well, I should say many psychologists are therapists, but certainly not all psychologists are therapists. Okay, psychologists do many things. Okay, and just to give you some examples, some psychologists pursue specialization in the area of biopsychology or neuroscience, which means that they investigate the link between our biology and our behavior. So, for instance, what role do the chemicals in our brain play in our behavior? What does one area of our brain do in terms of initiating certain behaviors, or how does an injury to the brain change a behavior, that kind of thing? Clinical psychology, on the other hand, that's again the field of psychology that most people probably think of when they think of the psychologist. They specialize in the evaluation, the diagnosis, and the treatment of psychological disorders. However, again, there are many other types of psychologists. Cognitive psychologists examine cognition, that is, the mental processes that we refer to in the definition of psychology. There are comparative psychologists who compare species differences in behaviors. So, for instance, our closest living relative, chimpanzees, they share a number of very similar behaviors to human beings. Many more behaviors in common with chimpanzees can be seen in humans than in non-human animals that are less closely genetically related. And that would, of course, suggest that there's a genetic component to certain behaviors. And again, that's something that biopsychologists or neuroscientists might be interested in. Counseling psychologists, very similar to clinical psychologists, but they tend to work in more higher functioning types of settings. In other words, they tend to deal less with more severe psychopathology. Okay? There are a number of other specializations within psychology, and the best place to really learn about those would be from the American Psychological Association. And they have a website, www.apa.org, where you can find lots of information about psychology, because that is the largest governing body. It has the largest membership of psychologists in the United States. Okay, so like I said, many different careers and specialties within psychology. In terms of where psychology came from, there are generally 3 early schools of thought. And when I say schools of thought, I mean psychology is a relatively new discipline. Okay, it wasn't around in the early 1800s, despite the fact that for thousands and thousands of years, people have probably been interested in understanding behavior and understanding the mind. Yet there was no science. There was no science called psychology. So, given that it's a very new discipline, different individuals who wanted to study psychology thought that the focus of study should be different things. Okay, so structuralists, they are generally considered to be the first school of thought. People from the structuralist view, they thought that it was important to try to identify the structures or the basic building blocks of mental life. Okay, so you can think of structuralists kind of like chemists. Okay, they thought that Just like if you want to understand water, you have to understand the molecules that make up water. Well, structuralists thought that if you want to understand the mind, you have to understand the basic building blocks of the mind. Okay, and the way that you go about doing this is via a tool called introspection, which means looking inward. Intro, inward, inspection, looking inward. Okay, that was how they thought that you would understand what's going on in the mind is simply to look inside of your mind. Now, of course, you would have to be trained in order to be able to report upon the contents of your mind, but that was how early psychologists attempted to understand the mind, which leads me to another point about early psychology, was that early psychologists studied the mind, not so much behavior. Okay, the next school of thought that became popular was called functionalism, and they were heavily influenced by a man named Charles Darwin, who had come up with a theory about how evolution occurs. That is, the functionalists, they wanted to understand how the mind functions. They wanted to know what the adaptive value of the mind was. What is it that, having a sense of self, for instance, allows us to do that many other organisms cannot do because they don't possess a sense of self. What is the function of being able to think about ourselves, being able to introspect? Then, of course, once again, we see another school of thought that is probably the one that you think of most when you think of psychology, the psychoanalytic school of thought. Okay, this is the one that was developed by Sigmund Freud. He's probably who most people think of when they think of psychology. Okay, the psychoanalytic school of thought, again being developed by Sigmund Freud, focused on the role of unconscious, the role of the unconscious part of the mind, and how that influences our behavior. And certainly it does. Certainly many of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis do occur because of unconscious processes. For instance, if you just look at how you're sitting right now, okay? Did you consciously mean to cross your legs if you're sitting with your legs crossed? Did you consciously think about putting your hands on top of your head to rest them there? If you find yourself in that position, how did you end up getting sidetracked from listening to the subject matter of what I'm talking about right now and start thinking about something that you'd like to do tomorrow? Okay, none of those things are driven by your conscious control. Many of the processes that go on our mind occur unconsciously, and that's a pretty good thing because we don't necessarily want to have to always be thinking about every little thing that we're doing, because then we wouldn't be able to think about other things. Now, in terms of modern psychology, which is very different from those first two or three schools of thought, structuralism and functionalism are no longer so much applicable today, although you can still see some of the roots in them. The psychoanalytic perspective, that is still present today, although it has changed a little bit. It's kind of referred to more as a psychodynamic perspective now, but it continues to emphasize unconscious drives and motives and conflicts that are often related to childhood experiences. Another dominant perspective today is the behavioral perspective, which really attempts to focus on only objective and observable aspects of behavior. Objective, once again, objective means that anybody could make the same observation that you're making. Okay, that's often contrasted with something that is subjective, which means that it's only observable by one individual. So, for instance, if you ask me, am I paying attention to you? I'm the only one that would be able to determine whether I am or not. Now, of course, I could say I'm paying attention to you, and anybody could observe that, but whether I actually am paying attention to you or not is something that is subjective, because it can only be determined by me. Okay? The humanistic perspective attempts to emphasize the role of free will, self-actualization, and really sees human nature as naturally positive and growth-seeking, which is in contrast to the psychodynamic perspective. Again, moving on, the cognitive perspective focuses on those mental processes that we talked about before. The biological perspective looks at the role of genetic factors and biological processes in the brain and other parts of the nervous system, including even the endocrine system. We talked about the role of testosterone in aggression before. Well, testosterone is regulated by the endocrine system, and so any of those factors, those biologically based mechanisms, are studied to understand what role they play in behavior. The evolutionary perspective looks at the role of evolutionary factors. Again, I mentioned how functionalism was influenced by evolutionary thought at the time, specifically natural selection. So it looks at what is the adaptive value of different aspects of behavior? How can we understand the role that natural selection has played in behaviors that we see? And then finally, the cultural perspective emphasizes the role that social interaction and cultural factors play in behavior and mental processes. So, they look at how do cultures differ in terms of behavior. So, for instance, there are some psychological disorders that are really only seen in certain cultures. They have historically been referred to as culture-bound syndromes. So the fact that you see them in some cultures and not other cultures is a strong indication that that culture is influencing our behavior. On the other side of things, there are some behaviors that are seen cross-culturally. That is, it doesn't matter what culture you're from, there are certain things that can be observed in all cultures. So, for instance, a smile is indicative of happiness in every single culture that has ever been investigated. Okay, so there's some universality to certain behaviors, but there's also some cultural specificity to behaviors as well. And really, the biopsychosocial model is a model that attempts to integrate all these different factors, the biological ones, the psychological ones, and the social forces. Now, the reason that we talk about these separate models is because it's difficult to be a jack of all trades, and when you're trying to understand behavior, you really need to focus on a limited number of aspects if you want to uncover anything that is explanatory in terms of behavior. So it's not to say that somebody who studies behavior from a biological perspective ignores cognitive or sociocultural or psychodynamic factors in behavior, but because of the necessity of specializing in a particular area, you tend to focus on one area, more or less to the exclusion of other areas. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some different types of research that psychologists engage in. First of all, research can be, in the field of psychology, broadly broken up into basic research, which is research that is conducted for the purpose of understanding and improving our knowledge of behavior, rather than for applying it, for instance. That is, we might be interested in what a specific area of the brain does, because we want to understand the relationship between the brain and the behavior. It's not necessarily because we're going to do anything to manipulate that area of the brain, although that is a potential possibility, but that would be considered more basic types of research. On the other hand, applied research is research that is designed specifically to solve certain problems. Okay, so for instance, if we want to try to figure out what's the best way to treat depression, we might compare different treatment modalities in order to see which one results in the greatest amount of improvement in depressive symptoms. That's applied research. It's not just for the sake of knowing which treatment is the best one. It's so that we can implement the best treatments. But given that psychology is a science, as I've been referring to, psychologists all follow the scientific method in terms of conducting their research. Okay, and the scientific method is really a cyclical process. Okay, it begins with a question. You can come up with any question about behavior. Your question could be, how do I do well on an exam in school? Well, if you're a scientist, after you ask that question, the first thing you would do is look to see what research has been done on improving exam performance. That is, you would conduct what's called a literature review. Okay, a literature review refers to the fact that people have studied the topic of exam performance before. Scientists have studied that, and they've written about it. Okay, they've published scientific articles on the topic of what are the factors that influence test performance. And so a scientist that has a question about this would look at that literature in order to see what is already known about it. Okay, and then on the basis of that, they would be able to make some sort of prediction about what they might expect would be the answer to their question. And this is called a hypothesis. Okay, specifically, it's a scientific hypothesis is one that is testable, meaning that there's a specific outcome that would either support or fail to support your prediction, that it's going to come out either one way or the other. When you make that hypothesis, you then need to decide upon a specific research design that will allow you to test that hypothesis. Okay, then you need to collect data and analyze it. And based upon the fact that you collected data, you're going to draw conclusions, and you want everyone else to be aware of what conclusions, what your results were that you found, and that results in the publication process. Okay, when you publish your results, other people can read about it, and that contributes to the development of theories. Okay, theories are what we use to explain various things. So, for instance, we talked about the behavioral theory, the psychoanalytic theory, the cognitive theory. All three of those things can explain, to some extent, why do people become depressed. Okay? From the psychoanalytic view, it has to do with unconscious conflicts. From the behaviorist view, it has to do with the fact that you're not doing enough things that you find pleasurable. And from the cognitive perspective, cognitive theorists would argue that it has to do with the way that you think about things. Okay, so in the scientific method, there are some very important terms that you should be familiar with in order to understand psychological science more generally. Okay, first of all, a hypothesis, as I mentioned, it is very specific. Okay, it is a testable prediction about how one factor or a variable is related to another. A variable is simply something that can vary. Okay, anything that can vary. That is happiness, sadness. Both of those things can vary, so they're both variables. Okay, gender is also a variable because it can vary. You could either be a man or you could be a woman, and we might want to know, how does being a man or a woman, one variable, relate to how happy or sad you are. Okay, both of those are also variables. Okay, before we get started though with testing hypotheses, we have to first define these variables. Okay, so what do I mean when I say happiness? What do I mean when I say sadness? An operational definition is a precise description of how the variables in a study will be observed and measured. So we can measure happiness based on facial expressions. More specifically, we could measure the magnitude of somebody's smile as an indication of happiness, or the magnitude of somebody's frown as a measure of sadness. Or we could ask people to rate on a scale of 0 to 10, how happy are you? 0 being the complete absence of happiness, 10 being the happiest you've ever been in your entire life. But both of those ways of defining happiness are excellent operational definitions because they're very precise and anybody could measure them the same way. Okay, another example of how would you define drug abuse? It might be operationally defined as the number of missed work days due to excessive use of an addictive substance. Okay? And another term that you may come across at some point is statistical significance. Okay? The way that we determine, so for instance, if we found that men rated themselves as happier than women, or vice versa, how would we know whether that is a meaningful difference or just something that could have occurred by chance? You know, if you just happen to ask these 5 men and these 5 women, you might have just asked the least happiest men and the most happy women about how happy they were. And it doesn't necessarily reflect a sex difference in happiness. It's just, you just happen to sample 5 unhappy men and 5 very happy women. Right? It would be like trying to estimate how tall women are by sampling women who are in the WNBA. Okay, they're much taller than the average. Okay, it's not as if women are really that tall in general, but you had a biased sample. And so what we need to know is how likely is it that a result in a study occurred just by chance. Okay, and that's what statistical significance tells us. It tells us how large of a difference do we have to find in order for that to be considered not due to chance. Okay. There are also some areas of ethical concern that psychologists need to be concerned about. First of all, they need to be concerned about the respecting the rights of human participants in research, and some of the major components of ethical research are informed consent, making sure that people are aware of the fact that they are participating in a study and that they are aware of what's being asked of them, that their participation is being voluntary, they're not being coerced into it, that they're not being deceived in terms of their participation. You know, you tell them the study's about one thing and it's really about something else. That's the use of deception, and it should be used very carefully and not be used if it's not necessary. And confidentiality, that is, your participation in research should not result in any behaviors that were identified in you being made public. Okay. We need to do the same thing about respecting the rights of non-human animal participants as well. Okay, even though the research on them is important, there do need to be safety measures in place to protect the rights of non-human animals as well. And finally, we need to respect the rights of psychotherapy clients. Okay, once again, we see confidentiality is extremely important in terms of psychotherapy. That is, all information must be kept strictly confidential. However, there are certain exceptions to that. For instance, if a client ever threatened to harm himself or others, that would be a reason that confidentiality could be broken. Also, if child abuse is suspected, that's another reason that confidentiality could be broken. But other than that, things that occur in the context of therapy are supposed to remain there. So, when we think about research, you might think that the word experiment is synonymous with research. However, it's not. Okay? Experiments are a very specific type of research, and they're a very important type of research to know about because it's the only type of research that really allows you to be very confident that you have identified the cause of an effect. Okay? What I mean by that is that when you find that variables are related, you don't necessarily know that they are related because one caused the other. Okay, I gave an example of drinking alcohol and level of aggression before, right? I said that just because you find that the more alcohol people drink, the more violent they are, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's alcohol that's causing them to be violent. As I mentioned, it could be that the environment that people drink alcohol in is causing them to become violent or aggressive. Okay, and by performing an experiment, that would allow you to determine which one of those factors potentially is in fact causing the increase in violence. And the reason that it could do that, that the experiment could allow you to make that determination, is because of the fact that if you're conducting an experiment, that means that the researcher has control over variables and can manipulate them. Okay, manipulate as opposed to simply observing them. Okay, descriptive research, on the other hand, does not allow you to draw cause and effect conclusions, nor does correlational research. Okay, correlational research is a way of identifying relationships, and the biological approach can use a combination of experimental, descriptive, and correlational approaches, but because psychology is interested in studying the mind and specifically studying the brain, there are certain biological methods that psychologists use in order to study the functions of the brain that they'll be discussed differently. Okay, so as I mentioned, experimental research is research in which you carefully control the scientific procedure and manipulate variables which allow you to determine cause and effect. Okay? The key features of an experiment are that you have an independent variable. That is the variable that is manipulated. Okay? The dependent variable is the variable that gets measured. So you manipulate the independent variable in order to see what effect that has on the dependent variable. The way to keep these things straight, because I know it's very confusing for students who are just starting to learn this, is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. Okay, so let's stick with the alcohol example. Okay, if we manipulate the level of alcohol people drink and measure their level of aggression, then the independent variable is level of alcohol consumed. The dependent variable is the amount of aggression that they engage in. Okay? Now, if we're performing an experiment, we need to have at least two groups. Okay? We're going to have one group that gets a certain amount of alcohol. Okay? But we're also going to have another group that gets no alcohol. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to give one group regular alcoholic beer, and they're going to be called the experimental group. We're going to give the other group, the control group, non-alcoholic beer. Okay? The reason that we do this is because we want them both to think that they're drinking alcohol, but we really only want one group to get the alcohol. Okay? How are we going to determine who gets the alcohol and who doesn't? Well, a critical feature of an experiment is that you don't leave it up to the research participants to decide are they going to drink alcohol or not. You want to randomly assign the participants to one of those two groups. Meaning, when I say random assignment, I mean that you flip a coin. Okay, heads, this person goes into the alcohol group. Tails, this person goes into the no alcohol group. Okay, that's what random assignment means, and that is absolutely critical. Okay, if you read any papers in psychological or medical research where an experiment is conducted, you can almost guarantee that that you'll come across the words random assignment. Okay, and the other thing about experiments is that they control confounding variables. So remember how I said before that the type of environment could also be related to the level of aggression, independent of the level of amount of alcohol consumed? Well, when we say controlling confounding variables, what we mean is that we would keep the environment constant. We would have people drink either alcoholic or non-alcoholic beer in the same exact environment. Okay? Because the environment is the same for both groups, that cannot explain any differences in level of aggression. Okay? When environments do vary, on the other hand, they vary with the amount of alcohol that's drank. You know, in some environments you don't drink alcohol. In other environments you do drink alcohol. That's what's referred to as a confounding variable. Okay, it's a variable that precludes you from being able to ascertain which one is responsible for causing the effect that you're observing. Okay, and there are a number of problems that most scientists would attempt to eliminate. For instance, experimenter bias. This is when the researcher influences the results in the expected direction. How do we control for that? Well, one way is we prevent the researcher from knowing what group people are in. So in a single blind study, for instance, the individual who's participating in the research study, the participant, they don't know whether they got the alcoholic or the non-alcoholic beverage. Okay, that's a single blind study, meaning that the participants don't know which group they were in. Okay, in a double-blind study, not only did the participants not know which group they were in, but also the researcher who's observing their level of aggression, they also don't know which group participants were assigned to. Okay, if the researcher doesn't know which group the participants were assigned to, then that can't influence their ratings of aggression in those two. We also have to be very careful about ethnocentrism. That is, believing that one culture's behavior is typical of all cultures, and/or that it's central and correct, and then further judge people by this standard. In other words, we have to be very careful about generalizing our results on the basis of who was represented in the study. So, for instance, if we only looked at the effect of alcohol on aggression in men, then we wouldn't be able to say anything about what effect alcohol was in women because we didn't study women. We only studied men. So likewise, if we have one cultural group represented in a study, we don't necessarily know whether those results will generalize to another cultural group, given that we know that cultural differences sometimes do impact behaviors. Okay, so we talked about the experimental approach. We talked about what experiments are, how experimental research is a very specific type of research. Well, descriptive research involves different methods as well. Okay, descriptive research involves what's referred to as naturalistic observation, surveys, and case studies. Okay, but the goal of descriptive research is to observe and record behavior without manipulating variables. Okay, so remember, there's no manipulation of variables in either descriptive research or either in correlational research, but there is manipulation of variables in experimental research. That is a major and important difference to be aware of. Okay, so in descriptive research, we have naturalistic observation. This refers to observing or observable, that is, in a participant's natural state or habitat. Okay, I like to think about this as going into a non-human animal's natural environment, okay, and observing them. So, for instance, there's a woman named Jane Goodall who went to observe chimpanzee behavior in their natural environment. Okay, that is quite different than observing their behavior in a zoo. Okay, that's the only place that I've ever observed live chimpanzees was in a zoo, and their behavior is not going to be the same as it is in their natural environment. Okay, so if we want to learn about the way that behavior truly occurs, many times it's best to go about making those observations in the natural environment. Okay, in their natural state or habitat. Okay, survey research is a technique that questions a large sample of people to assess their behaviors and attitudes. So most students take surveys at some point. Usually, many times they'll take them at the end of the semester when they're asked to fill out ratings of how much they enjoyed the class, for instance. Case study is also another type of descriptive research, one that we have to be very careful of. Okay, this is an in-depth study of a single research participant. The reason that I say we have to be very careful with case studies is that anything that you observe in one individual, because remember, we're talking about a single participant here, this may not occur in anybody else. Okay, we all have somebody we know that is very unique, and we would say that this person is not really a whole lot like anyone else that we know, right? So if you study that one individual, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about anybody else. Okay, so you have to be very careful with generalizing from case studies. On the other hand, case studies can be extremely informative. The most important arguably the most important case study in the history of psychology has been on an individual who went by the initials HM. Okay, we'll talk about him in the context of memory, but he's an individual who had a radical surgical procedure conducted on him. It was kind of experimental at the time. He had brain surgery, and they removed certain parts of his brain that resulted in him having a loss of the ability to remember new information. Okay, and this individual was studied for many years, and we learned more about memory from studying this one individual than anyone else. So it was an extremely informative study, and it was just based on one person. So, like I said, we have to be very careful, but at the same time, case studies can be extremely informative. Okay. Correlational research is a method, a research method in which two or more variables are observed or measured, but again, not directly manipulated, in order to identify relationships between them. Okay. Now, when it comes to correlational research, correlations can be described based on a numerical value. Okay, they're calculated based on the observations that are made, and the value that gets calculated can range from -1 to +1, anywhere between -1 and +1. The closer a number, the correlation is to 1, the stronger the relationship. Okay, the closer it is to 0, the weaker the relationship. So a correlation of 0 means that there is no relationship between two variables. Okay, some examples here are no relationship there. Okay, doesn't matter what your shoe size is. That doesn't tell us anything about what your level of intelligence is. On the other hand, we have correlations that can go in different directions. Okay, a positive correlation, okay, demonstrated on the far left here, is a correlation in which the two variables go in the same direction. That is, as the value of one tends to increase, the value of the other tends to increase. Likewise, as the value of one decreases, the value of the other one decreases. So, if we look at maternal smoking and number of birth defects, the more cigarettes that are smoked, the more defects we see. Likewise, the fewer cigarettes that are smoked, the lesser fetal defects we see. Okay, so that's why that's an example of a positive correlation. On the other hand, if we look at the relationship between exam scores and class absences, we see that exam scores increase as number of class absences decreases. Likewise, exam scores decrease as number of class absences increases. So the two variables go in the opposite direction, and that's what defines a negative correlation. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the biological research methods, they can incorporate aspects of descriptive research, correlational research, and experimental research, but they're very specific in terms of the fact that they're looking at aspects of biological functioning. Okay, so a couple of the most commonly used methods of studying, in this case, brain activity, are EEG, which measures the electrical activity of the brain. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the brain in the next lesson. The CT scan, which gives you a picture of the brain. Okay, this is very useful if you think that there's been an injury to the brain. It'll show up on a CT scan. A PET scan, on the other hand, it doesn't show you the structure of the brain, but it shows you the metabolic activity of the brain. Okay. Some other methods with even better resolution are MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Again, it gives you a picture of the brain, but unlike CT scans, it's not an X-ray image. It's an image that is very sophisticated and results from a magnetic signal that results from the movement of hydrogen atoms in the brain. And then finally, we have functional MRI, which looks at blood flow in the brain. Okay, this is a very common form of brain imaging that you're likely to see reported in the news quite often. It looks at blood flow with the assumption that wherever blood is flowing to in the greatest proportion, that's the area of the brain that is most active. So if you ask somebody to do a task while you're measuring the blood flow in their brain, and the blood flow increases when they do task A in the right frontal area of the brain, it decreases in the left posterior part of the brain. But when they do task B, it increases in the left posterior part and decreases in the right frontal part. Well, then you can draw some conclusions about what areas of the brain might be involved in performing task A and what areas of the brain might be involved in performing task B. Other methods involve looking at the cellular structure of the brain. So, for instance, we have in our brains many different types of neurons, and we can look at those under a microscope in order to understand, what certain types of neurons might be doing in different areas of the brain. Since we tend to have certain types of neurons located in one area, other types located in other areas. And we can also measure electrical recordings by placing electrodes on the brain itself. So if we go back to EEG for a minute, electroencephalography, that could be accomplished by simply placing the electrodes on the scalp surface. Okay, it's completely non-invasive. On the other hand, we can also put them surgically on top of the brain surface underneath the scalp and get an even more accurate measure of the electrical activity of the brain.